Hello, and welcome to our review of the lupus literature from February. We record these podcasts for you every month, so you will always be able to keep up to date on the latest literature and expert opinions. I'm Professor Richard Fury, Chief of the Division of Rheumatology, Department of Medicine at Northwell Health in New York. Today, I'm joined by Professor Victoria Worth, who is Professor of Dermatology and Medicine and Chief of the Division of Dermatology at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Vicky.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And today we're going to review two key publications from February covered on the Lupus Forum.
All right, so Vicky, tell us about the first presentation, and that's Belimumab versus telitacicept in sequential treatment after rituximab for refractory lupus nephritis, a real-world multi-center study.
Yeah, so this was a study that was real world. It wasn't randomized. It was basically the treatment was based on what the patients preferred. And they all got steroids and background immunosuppressives. And I gather when they didn't get better, then they got Rituxan. And this was a study that then looked at patients who, when they got after Rituxan, they were given either Belimumab or telitacicept, and then followed over a period of time to see how they did in terms of their renal function, their proteinuria, and other factors. In fact, they were followed for about 26 months, plus or minus 12 months. So that was sort of the range. And there were a total of 49 patients who were treated this way, and about 81% of them attained some kinds of response, whether partial or complete, and then 61% attained a complete response. When they looked at the two groups, and again, not randomized, just treated, it turned out that there was really no significant difference between the two medications that were used. And the SLEDAI-2K score did decrease in the total cohort from 13 down to 5 during the course of the study. And AEs were consistent with previous studies, including immunoglobulin deficiency, respiratory tract infection, and urinary tract infection. So I think on balance then, it looks like Belimumab or telitacicept as sequential treatment after Rituxan may be a viable option of treatment for refractory lupus nephritis patients, and at least that's more or less the conclusion of the study. So let me know if you have any questions.
I happen to have some questions for you. So for the audience, we know Belimumab, right? It's an antibody against BLyS, also known as BAFF. And telitacicept is an agent that inhibits both APRIL and BLyS or BAFF. So the concept of maintaining patients on a BAFF inhibitor after the receipt of rituximab is not a new one. And the scientific rationale is that BAFF levels rise after B-cell depletion and create an environment favorable to the repletion of autoreactive B-cells. Now, it seems to me that the dose of rituximab in these regimens, either a single dose or 2 doses, was far less aggressive than what we typically use in lupus nephritis. So the question I have is that considering that nearly all the patients received mycophenolate or CNI after the rituximab, what role do you think the rituximab played, if any at all?
Well, so I mean, actually, I think they probably continued on. They had gotten MMF or CNI actually also before being put into the rituximab treatment arms, and so if you were to think of it just as an issue of MMF, we know from the studies that have been done that the effectiveness rate is relatively low compared to what was seen here. So your question is really, so how do we know, given the multifactorial kinds of approaches to treatment, how important is rituximab? And I don't think we're going to know that in this particular study, but I do think that the responses overall seem to be on aggregate better than what we see with any of these individual treatments. And we're at a time now where we're tending to use often more than one treatment, and to be getting in the range of 80% responses is pretty impressive, I would say, for lupus nephritis. But what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, very impressive. That was going to be my next question. A complete renal response rate of nearly 80% in the telitacicept group. I mean, it's amazingly high. We've never seen those kinds of numbers. So, do you think telitacicept is that good and holds a lot of promise? Or do you think it could just be the result of a small study population?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult in this kind of study where, again, it's not even randomized. And I don't think we're going to know the answer to that. And also, the response rates included partial response, and partial response was defined in a fairly generous fashion where you could have like less than 3 grams, I think, of protein in a day and call that a partial response. And so, I think that it would be really require, I think, a careful study that's comparing treatments in a randomized fashion to really be confident in these types of results.
Okay, I want to ask about some safety issues. So I don't know if I saw the answers to my questions in the article. But I noticed that about 40% of the patients had reductions in their IgG levels below 600 milligrams per deciliter, and about 40% developed infections. I just wondered if they stated whether there was a relationship between these two events.
Yeah, great question. I mean, where they said they saw the biggest sort of effect was in people who were already somewhat hypogammaglobulinemic to begin with. That correlated with a significant drop in the immunoglobulins. But in terms of how to link up the decrease to the rate of infection, I think that was not evident to me in the article itself. I think it's a really important question, and clearly many of these patients did, not surprisingly, although again, they did not get that much rituximab, and to a point where you would expect to see on that basis low immunoglobulins. So I think, again, it's one of these things where we need to understand the side effect profile and what seems to correlate with what. And I don't think I kind of got that yet from this article.
All right, and my last question for you. I mean, we're targeting B cells with all different strategies. We have cell therapy, T cell engagers, monoclonal antibodies, and so forth. So, do you think chronic BLyS or BAFF inhibition will become the norm after we deplete the B cells with whatever agents we choose to use?
I mean, there's a scientific rationale for doing that, right? If BAFF is going up after rituximab and you want to give an antibody that's inhibiting BAFF, there is some thought about that. I guess the question would be that I can understand that acutely, but to do it chronically is also something that I think needs further study before I would say we should do that for every single patient. Although we do know, for instance, that this type of targeted BAFF or APRIL approach has been Belimumab got approved for nephritis, so in and of itself. And so I think we need to do these studies really carefully before we can come to that conclusion.
Okay, let's move on to the next article. So that's entitled Efficacy and Safety of Obinutuzumab in Active Lupus Nephritis. The lead author was someone named Fury. So there was a vote on this, so I didn't choose it by myself. But I think a very important article. You can comment on that as well a little bit later. So let me just tell you the rationale. Go back, oh my gosh, almost 25 years when we used rituximab in lupus studies. There was the Explorer study, a study of rituximab in SLE, and then the LUNAR trial of rituximab in proliferative nephritis. And neither study achieved its endpoint, at least on a statistical basis. But what emerged after those studies is the feeling that rituximab was not adequately depleting B cells. So the feeling was greater B cell depletion might yield better results. And so we put to the test what was then a while ago a new drug, obinutuzumab, which was sort of a third generation. I call it the granddaughter or grandson of rituximab, a far more potent B cell depleter. And actually, it was approved in 2013 for CLL. So the question arose whether we should repeat the LUNAR trial, a study in proliferative nephritis, but no longer with rituximab, but with this new, more potent B cell depleter. So the bottom line is that yes, we did a phase 2 study called the Nobility trial, and we saw some very nice results with a peak effect size at 1.5 years after the start of the study of 20 percentage points. So that led to a phase 3 study, which was called Regency. So let me tell you a little bit about Regency. We recruited about 270 patients, and there was a one-to-one randomization of placebo versus obinutuzumab on a background of steroids and mycophenolate. In order to get into the study, the patients have had to have had a kidney biopsy within 6 months of entry, showing proliferative disease, but not too much damage. And they also had to have proteinuria greater than 1 gram. So as I mentioned, the randomization was 1-to-1. There were basically 3 courses of therapy. So at baseline, 1,000 milligrams within twice, given 2 weeks apart. And then that was repeated at 6 months. And then at 1 year, this is where it got a little tricky. If one was on obinutuzumab, you either got a single dose then or a double dose. So we can talk about that later. Anyway, the endpoint was at 1.5 years, and we had a successful study with about a little over 46% of the patients who were on obinutuzumab achieving a complete renal response, whereas those on placebo, and again, it's not just placebo, the patients were on background mycophenolate and steroids. So the complete renal response rate in that group was about 33%. So the difference was a little over 13 percentage points, and it was statistically significant. Now, there were a whole bunch, there were about 5 or 6 key secondary endpoints. And the top 2 key secondary endpoints were successful. And so the very first one was the achievement of a complete renal response and the ability to taper prednisone to less than 7.5 milligrams for the last 12 weeks of the study. The second key secondary was a reduction in the protein creatinine ratio to under 0.8 with no intercurrent events. Why 0.8? Well, there have been studies showing that if you can get your proteinuria down to 0.7, 0.8 within the first year of therapy, then there's a much greater chance that you will do better long term. There were other secondary endpoints. I don't think we have time to go into them, but let me just talk a little bit about safety. So there were equivalent numbers of adverse events in the 2 groups, but as far as serious adverse events, a little bit higher in the obinutuzumab group than in the placebo group, and it was driven by infections. And those infections were mainly COVID-related infections, because this study was done at the peak of the COVID pandemic. It's not exactly an opportune time to do a study with an immunosuppressive. I mean, anifrolumab long-term extension had the same issue. But the second half of this particular study, of the Regency study, we saw a significant decline in COVID-related events. So it's very important that patients, I think all our patients, need to get vaccinated for COVID, for pneumococcus, for flu, for shingles, and RSV. I haven't figured that one out, but probably throw that into the mix as well. So we had a successful study with obinutuzumab, which confirmed that greater B cell depletion would yield better results. And the FDA will rule on this probably within the next 6 months or so.
Excellent. Well, it's a really interesting and exciting study. I know it's garnered already a lot of attention. I had some questions about the dosing interval. This is a better B cell depleter. It's being given at least for the study purposes every 6 months. Do the B cells come back by the time they're getting retreated?
No, so we saw that in nobility, and we once again saw that in the Regency study. Obinutuzumab not only is a greater B cell depleter than rituximab, it depletes for a longer period of time. So patients who were randomized to obinutuzumab were essentially B cell depleted for the whole 1.5 years until the primary endpoint at week 76.
I mean, it just seems that rituximab usually it's 6 months, right? So you wonder whether the dosing interval could be even longer and still have the same effect. But it seems that they did show a difference, and maybe that kind of profound uh, suppression does make a difference as long as you're not in the middle of a COVID epidemic. But this is a really interesting study. Where does it's going to be, I guess, discussed with the FDA at some point? Is that correct?
I think that some point is very soon. Yes.
Yeah, great. All right. Do you have any other comments that you wanted to make about this?
No, I think the important points were made. Everybody can read the article. It was published. It was published online, February 7th in the New England Journal.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for reviewing this article and the other one. They really, it's been a great month for thinking about new approaches for treating lupus nephritis.
All right, well, that's all we have got time for today. And thank you for joining me, Vicki. It's great to hear your thoughts on the latest developments in lupus management.
Thank you very
And
much.
yeah, thank you everybody out there for listening. You can find the slide decks for these papers at lupusforum.com. The Lupus Forum is free to access, and all of our content is free to download. If you're not already, make sure to register for updates on the Lupus Forum. You'll receive email updates when new content is made available. You can also follow us at Lupus Forum on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thanks again, and see you next month.